it's a rare commodity, but it's extremely valuable and it makes a huge difference.
The loss of an offensive tackle. It is a lot more than next man up. In today's episode of the SumerSports Show, we're going to dive into all the ways that an injury at that specific position can alter a team's season. We've got the data that describes the fallout, the reasons it's such a big drop-off when those guys go out, and why good replacements are so hard to find. Mike Maccagnan, former Jets GM, is going to join us shortly with some experience in this department from the front office, as will Brandon Thorn, who is my favorite trenches analyst, provides consistently good breakdowns of O-line play in particular. So he'll be a great resource with which to have this conversation. I'm Lindsay Rhodes. Sam Bruckhouse is with me as always. And speaking of resources, boy, do we have a new one for you to use when researching NFL-related topics. It's been a huge week for us at SumerSports, Sam.
SumerBrain, SumerSports.com/SumerBrain. Everyone needs to navigate there now because we just released probably the first deep analysis football chatbot available. And Lindsay, this has become something that both of us use all the time to get the insights that we present on this show, the stuff that you can find on our Twitter. And basically what it does is it takes the crux of Sumer Sports' data and allows you to analyze it like you are a true analyst, get down as deep as possible. I've had an immense blast using it, and I'm really excited to see how everyone else does.
Yeah, it's really good at like multivariable data heavy questions, right? Like this is the thing that I know you and I are both the most excited about is that there are questions that are really hard to find answers to without sitting there and doing it manually all day long. Simply because if you can find the different data points, and a lot of people have to go to multiple websites to find those things in the first place, right? If you even know which websites have different data points versus, this one's over here and this one's over here, at least this one will put it all in one place for free, by the way. But also the fact that you can kind of layer different filters onto a question is the part that is really changing my life as a football researcher the most. And you're going to hear really specific examples in this show of the ways that I have used it recently, and the ways that I think there will be some good examples that will come up that can kind of steer you towards how to use the product.
Right. And just at the high level, the ability to get true rate stats over the participation of a player is something that is not really out there. And is really key to understanding how these offensive linemen are playing, how these quarterbacks are playing, is understanding what they're doing at each opportunity. That's not really something you can just get off the basic statistical websites. And it's now something you can get in basically fractions of a second, which is really exciting.
Yeah, it's awesome. So highly recommend that all of you go try this out. It's a beta. It's in beta right now. We should make sure that we hammer that point home. Like any tech product, it is not infallible. And so there are going to be issues that pop up, things that it cannot do. And so we're prepared for that. That's partially why we have this open beta process is we want as many prompts as possible. We want to find out where the problems are as quickly as possible. And machines like this learn more quickly through volume. And so we want you to help us break the brain so that then we can build it back up into the product that will ultimately benefit those of us that use it the most. So that is SumerBrain. Go find it at SumerSports.com/SumerBrain. That's not the only product we released this week.
We're busy. We're busy over here at Sumer Sports. It's the season and we are also putting out the goods.
Yeah. Sumer Player Varsity, also released earlier this week. This is an app that you can find in the App Store. It's a tool for high school players meant to democratize the recruiting process, using tech to create kind of a centralized database for recruiting that I said it's for high school players, but honestly, there's a lot of benefit that I can see for college programs, high school programs, just as a general resource. Tell me a little bit about Sumer Player Varsity and what it does.
So this is something that if you are a recruit, if you are an 8th grader, ninth grader in high school, you can go in and immediately get seen. You can immediately log all of your measurables, which are very key. And then also we will use our technology to help you do all of these things and understand more about the recruitment process. This is a really key thing that has been asked for by coaches. Coaches are always trying to do the best for their players. I've been down in Texas and Dallas and Houston discussing with some of the best coaches in those areas what they need, and Sumer Player provides a lot of that stuff. So, especially if you are someone with, kids, or if you're listening to this show that's young and just loves football, go check out Sumer Player.
Yeah, and especially, it was created with a certain type of high school player in mind. It will benefit, all of them, but specifically, we wanted to create a product that made it easier for players to be found in the recruiting process. So they're not spending all of their time creating all of these cut-ups and trying to figure out how they're gonna get an email or a social media post in front of a college coach just to get their attention. This is for people who go to schools that don't see a lot of scouts or college coaches come through from a scouting standpoint. And we had an example in a conversation. We talked to Nakobe Dean, who's on the Philadelphia Eagles, in the offseason. And he talked about how when he was in high school and he was getting some recruiting attention because he's obviously good enough to play in the NFL, he felt like he had to delay his commitment because he wanted these coaches and scouts to continue coming by the school, which didn't usually get that many people coming through, so that his teammates could be seen and find an opportunity. And what we learned from that conversation is that we wanted to build a way for other people who are at schools like that, who maybe didn't have the money to go to some of these high profile camps where scouts are looking for talent, to be seen. And so you can use our technology to capture your measurables on a phone. We can get your 40 time and then verify it. We can get all of those types of measurables, your wingspan, your height, your hand span. And then there's leaderboards. You can see where you rank nationally. There's lots of different cool, there's a fit finder in there where you can look at your measurables and see what kind of college is a good fit for you. There's lots of very cool things here. So go play around in the app. Like I said, it's out right now. That is the Sumer Player Varsity app, wherever you get your apps. But a lot of cool stuff to come in a lot of different areas. Let's get to the O-line conversation. I don't know if we've seen more offensive tackles that are regular starters leaving with injuries this year, or if it just feels like narratively it's happened in a few places in ways where it has been so obviously dramatically impactful. Um, but it feels like there have been some examples of offensive tackles who have left with injury, and then just the ways in which that has clearly affected what teams are trying to do. The Chargers are a perfect example, obviously, as a team that started the season so strong, with high expectations. They lose Rashawn Slater. Okay, that's a bummer. They seem to pick up fine with Joe Alt. Then Joe Alt goes out, and I'm left wondering, like, I literally don't know how you even try to fix this problem if you're Joe Hortiz.
Right, and it's shown up in the data as well. We're seeing a faster time to throw from Justin Herbert. We're seeing quicker times to pressure, negatively affecting that and probably affecting that time to throw as well. And especially in a small sample, since we saw Alt go out as well, we are seeing a lot more pressures and more sacks. And so all that implies that the scheme needs to change, that the quarterback is adjusting to what he expects to happen. And especially given that that's a quarterback who, number one, has seen a lot, had a lot of different play callers and seen success. And it seems as if they've gotten their wide receiver position figured out. It's a pretty big shame that we can't see the Chargers with a full deck.
Yeah, I wanna go over those stats one more time, that you rattled off there, because I think that not just in the Chargers case, but in a few other cases, Colton Miller, who is somebody that we talked about on our quarter poll progress report as one of the best tackles in the league, he promptly gets hurt and misses week 5. The numbers with and without Colton Miller for Las Vegas are similar to what you described with with the Chargers, Taylor Decker missed week 5 for the Lions, and there was a massive drop-off also, and they're consistently in those categories that you mentioned: time to throw, time to pressure, sack rate, and then I think that this one's maybe one of the most interesting ones to me because I think it is the product of all of the things that we already mentioned, and that is average depth of target. Comes way down. And so what you're seeing in Las Vegas is that Colton Miller being out brings the average depth of target down by 2 yards. In Detroit, the average depth of target came down from 8.1 with Decker on the field to 4.7 with him off the field. In Los Angeles, average depth of target since Joe Alt went out goes from 9.4 to 5.2. It just impacts what you're able to do offensively by shrinking the field so dramatically. And I would imagine that that's all tied to got to get the ball out fast, no time for these longer developing routes. And you can see the ways that Justin Herbert's going to throw the ball a ton and not rack up a ton of yards. Like, it just has such a wide-ranging impact on offenses.
Definitely. And I think the best example, if you want to get a little larger sample, especially given they're back in this scenario, is the Minnesota Vikings. They have seen Christian Darrisaw miss most of last year and the early part of this year, and then the late part of last year. And now the current state of the team is missing Brian O'Neill over on the right side. And it's interesting to see how they have managed this. We really only see a true drop off when they are missing Christian Darrisaw, the left tackle. Now, is that a game plan thing? Is that due to the changes in quarterbacks from Sam Darnold to JJ McCarthy to Carson Wentz? It kind of outlines the entanglement, but at the end of the day, they're still getting sacked more and they're still getting pressured more when those players are not on the field. And so regardless of the scheming around, we're going to talk to some people who can better discuss that it's just really hard to find really good tackles like this.
Yeah, and there are examples everywhere, right? Like, in terms of some of the examples that we talked about where their backups came in and promptly put up very low rated pass block Sumer scores. That was the case with the Lions. Giovanni Manu, am I pronouncing that correctly? Came in and struggled in week 5, was our single lowest rated player in pass block Sumer score in week 5. There are some other examples from around the league where that was the case. And I think that points to a larger picture here about just lack of depth at this position. And I'm really curious about why it is that there are so few guys that you can turn to. I feel like, we talk about the running back position all the time, and the fact that running backs don't matter, and you can get a guy in the 6th round, you plug him into a good offense, and it almost doesn't matter how individually talented that player is, so long as they're talented enough. And it feels like this position, maybe more than others, aside from quarterback, it feels like there just is there are a lack of viable options.
Right. I wanted to put a data point to this. And moreover, I wanted to make sure that the eye matched the AI here, because with offensive linemen, it's very difficult to figure out exactly what they're doing, given they're typically working in tandem with the rest of the offensive line and with the quarterback. So the first thing I did was go and look at our Sumer Scout grades that we share with teams. And there's really 11 or so quality starters, like true guys who you can expect to win matchups, that we have in the league as according to our scouts. And then I cross-referenced it with our Sumer scores from this season. And there's 7 players with 2 or more blue chip pass grades and 4 players with 2 or more blue chip run grades. So what that really lines up is maybe about a third of the league really has a tackle that they can expect to dominate at any given point in time. And it starts to really drop off after that into guys who can more play a role, or guys who are more of a swing tackle. And so it really indicates when you have a guy like Christian Darrisaw, or you have a guy like Joe Alt and Rashawn Slater, it's going to be immensely difficult to recreate what they were doing both on one-on-one matchups and pass blocking and in the run game as well.
Mike Maccagnan joining the conversation now, longtime NFL front office executive, former Jets GM. Aside from a quarterback, Mike, is there a tougher loss to metabolize as a team than the loss of a starting offensive tackle?
It's interesting. I would say it ranks very high, very high. Only because a lot of those situations, if you lose especially a high caliber player, those are difficult. Those are very difficult not only to replace in game, but usually it's depends what the injury is, short term, long term. The only other positions that would kind of be similar. I mean, every position is important. But when for example, you lose a corner, like corners are isolated players that pretty much get one-on-one matchups. So left tackles and pass protection get a lot of one-on-one matchups generally, at least in the older days, versus the better pass rushers. Everybody moves people around, tries to scheme things, but if the quarterback's is right-handed, and he sees the rush coming at him, sometimes he has a little better time to adjust, react, avoid. The blindside ones are the ones where you get the strip sacks, you get the big hits, and it can rattle quarterbacks because they get nailed from the blind side. It actually affects how they how they play the game a little bit.
So I want to go into the process of what exactly happens in season when a tackle goes down. So generally, you look at the depth chart, you got your starters, and then typically those guys at second position are swing guys or kind of have to fill a couple spots. Are you immediately looking to which one of those guys can fill in? Are you considering trades if it's before the trade deadline? What is kind of the check boxes that you're trying to fill in order
What
to
is
fill that
Joe
position?
Ortiz going through right now?
Yeah, I could probably sympathize a little bit. Having obviously been in those positions and been on teams that have had those issues. So what happens is, I think the backup real quick, just so that everybody understands a little bit on the inside how it works. You do so much work internally for many different cases and scenarios that present themselves. And again, in a perfect world, you have really good players behind every starter, but that's not reality because of the way the NFL is. So I think the first thing you tend to do when you have the injury, you have an injury, you have to figure out what the duration of the injury is. Is this, just getting you through this game, or is it going to be a 3-game, 4-game window, or is it done for the year? And go from there. In game, you generally have a number 2 scenario or you have a backup in place. Everybody comes out of preseason with a backup scenario for what if your left tackle goes down or your starting offensive tackle goes down. And generally you have time to kind of work on that. You do a lot of that work in the off season, but you can do some things during the season. I would say this early in the season, not that it's an ideal time to have an injury, but early in the season, you may have more options out there. There may be veteran offensive tackles that, especially left tackles that are highly compensated, that maybe the market, is not it wasn't there for them, but they opted to kind of sit and wait for an injury. That happens quite often. So you may have an opportunity to kind of go find somebody on the street that can come in and maybe not be at the same level, but a similar level. And then after that, most of the time you have a short-term solution to get you through a game. And then you have to, after you get through the game, you don't want to kind of move multiple parts in the game. You don't want to move your right tackle to your left tackle. Sometimes you have to, and then plug in a new right tackle. You want to keep as much continuity in place because that's one of the few position groups that the unit kind of plays better than the individual parts, because they kind of work together cohesively. And there's a lot of preparation goes into that. So kind of a long answer to it, but the first thing you do is you figure out the injury scenario, what you're dealing with, and then you immediately during the game, you're probably calling your pro director and going, "Hey, let's find out who's on the street right now. Let's get him in for a workout on Tuesday. Let's be first in line." So somebody else who's a tackle also, you're not competing against them. And then but a lot of the work you do is in the off season to kind of build your roster to prepare for those possibilities and go from there.
We gave some examples earlier in the show about some of the ways that tackles getting hurt impacted various teams around the league currently or recently this season, and the drop off in play at their position when the backups came in. It seems pretty clear that this is a tough position to just turn to the sideline, and I know you've got your plans in place and that's your next best option. but, like, it's a real different life when you turn to that backup offensive tackle. Why is it, in your experience, that there are so few good offensive tackles? Why is the drop off so great at this particular position?
Well, I think it's like a lot of positions. It just gets exposed more because other positions you can sort of assume you can basically take the injury and still maintain a pretty decent level of play. Again, you get to certain positions like tackle, like and cornerback, and other positions like that are really isolated in individual matchups. What happens a lot of times when you have a really good tackle, you don't have to scheme or protect or, you know, because really what happens when you have an injury, the first thing coaches will do is adjust the game plan, even in game. In some cases, you're going to maybe shift and maybe work a tight end over there or an H-back or a running back chipping coming out of the backfield, especially if it's an elite player he's playing across from. What happens a lot of times is when you get into these scenarios, every time ideally you're a balanced team and you don't have to sit there and like a boxer, you have your good punches and you're playing defense a lot, trying to make sure you don't get a big punch to you. So what happens a lot of times is coaches can game plan and scheme things, but once you start doing that, you start limiting what you can do. Ideally, you want to present the defense with a number of different options, but all of a sudden now, if you're dealing with a backup offensive tackle, you're going to likely scheme it a little bit to get you at least through the game or even into future games from a matchup standpoint. Just I don't want to say you limit your playbook, but you adjust it and you start, limiting the number of things you can give the defense a threat to deal with.
So highlighting the scheme changes, two moves for the same player in the past 2 years have really caught my eye. Both the Vikings last year and the Browns this year traded for Cam Robinson. And both of those kind of ended up in those scheme changes. And so I'm wondering of what the conversation was between Kwesi Adofo-Mensah, Andrew Berry, and their head coaches. When the decision is made to go ahead and make a scheme change, does that affect the way that you plan to approach the tackle position? Does that mean that you may be looking for another tackle than the type of left tackle you had prior? Or are you just trying to get the best guy out there, given that the drop-off is so big?
Yeah, and when I say scheme change, I want to make sure it's not that you change your blocking scheme completely. You go from one style to one technique to another technique, like from a power technique to a zone or whatever you want to play. Basically, it's more how you assist the player. Because obviously, if you put a tight end on okay, so you're in pass protection, you want to spread everybody out. You want to just have like 4x1 or whatever. If you're trying to protect a tackle, you may align the tight end in passing downs attached to whatever side of the line of scrimmage where your tackle is, at your second string tackle. It'll widen the defensive end, tend to widen the defensive end out. They may basically slow the defensive end with the tight end's release. There's all these little things you can do. The problem ends up being you're adjusting what you ideally want to do to try to make sure you play with what you're playing with. So when you're looking for the player, you're looking for the best player available. The one thing I would say, and this, I don't know if you guys have touched on this at all with your analytics, but it's interesting when everybody in general goes through and watches offensive tackles, the worst case scenario is when a guy gets beat really fast. Maybe he goes out there, he lunges, he gets top heavy, he shoots his hands, and the defensive end wins very quickly at the line of scrimmage and goes flying into the backfield, totally disrupting the play. Hitting the quarterback, again, quarterbacks, players are designed at a certain time and place for the receivers run their routes into their zones to get open. That's what you see a lot. So in essence, we find a lot of veteran offensive tackles that may not be necessarily top players at this point in time in their career, but they're savvy veterans. They understand, they learn to play within their weaknesses, their limitations, and quite frankly, they get beat slower than maybe a worse player who goes out there and, I mean, that's the worst case scenario is when you have, and I've been on teams where we had players that, that again, when you watch what happens, they get beat really fast. That gives you no real chance for the play to develop. And I don't know if that's this kind of a more layman's terms of what coaches and GMs deal with all the time. So it's not like you're necessarily looking to go, hey, let's find a certain type of tackle. You probably want to find a guy that can pass block first. If you're going to take something lesser, you'll give up on the run block, but you'll try to get the better pass blocker because that's the harder thing to really adjust and protect for.
Should we expect, or is it a cognizant choice, I guess, that the coaches are making offensively when we see the average depth of target come down, we see the time to throw go down? Is that a, hey, pressure might come faster, and here's our plan with how to deal with that? Or is that just a product of the pressure coming and then this happens as a result? Is that purposeful, I guess is what I'm asking?
Again, it's a universal thing you're commenting on, but I think in general, and my background's in personnel, but I've been around a lot of coaching staffs and watched this happen. Coaches are trying to do their jobs of, the best of their ability with what they have at hand. But I think you'll see correlations with, hey, they may adjust things. They may adjust things to not put their guys in and ask the players to do things that they'll struggle to do. It's one thing to, scheme something up and protect a player. It's another thing just to keep, hey, we're just going to keep running the same stuff, even though we have a drop off in that particular player at that position. So you may see them, a little more emphasis on the run game, a little more emphasis on, getting the ball out fast. And everything's in their playbook. It's just a question of what they want to dial up and run. But I would say you just because you lose your left tackle or right tackle or whoever, you may find statistics that seem contrary. Like all of a sudden, like, well, okay, there's less occurrences of this. Well, they may choose to schematically protect certain players or get rid of the ball quicker or just, adjust what they're doing. Because in the end, whether you win by a lot or win by a little, it's just that all these games come down to the margins. And that's where you see so many close games in the NFL. And you see so many teams beat other teams that may have a better record. Because like I said, these games are really chess matches for the coaches at a very high level.
Looking to the draft, and I know that we all know that offensive tackle is a premium position and that if there are good offensive tackles in the draft, they tend to go very high. Anecdotally speaking, as practice, do you tend to see very many offensive tackles go later in the draft that actually end up on a field?
Not every starting tackle in the NFL is a first round draft pick. There's lots of good players that have come into the league at various spots. And the one that comes to mind for me a little bit, and I do think, and this is with Philadelphia with Howie Roseman, and I think Howie's one of the best GMs in the league, if not the best. He's literally at the top of his game. But when he drafted Jordan Mailota, who we actually did a lot of work on, we were going to draft him too, potentially. And like a lot of teams were interested in him. But Howie found, as he's developed into, one of the top 10, I haven't ranked all the tackles, but in my mind, he's one of the top 10 or less, maybe offensive tackles in the NFL. And he's a rare guy, but he was a 7th round draft pick. When you watch something like that, there are players you can identify and find. And when you do find those type of players, and it could be at any position, that is really where you make a difference. So everybody tries to make sure they're accurate to the best of their ability on the first 3 to 4 rounds, but the difference makers sometimes are these 5th, 6th, 7th rounders. And there's a long history of later round offensive tackles in particular that have played in the league. And I think what happens is people don't realize it depends where they are. And they're bigger athletes, and they develop at a different pace. And quite frankly, my personal belief was I always thought with offensive linemen in particular, guys who can play within their limitations. So that's where the technique and the coaching and the scheme kind of helps, is that players protect their weaknesses, basically. So if they're not overly quick-footed and they're exceptionally smart and they're strong to the inside, so they can handle the power or the conversion of the power for a rusher, they work the angles and they again, in some cases they just get beat slower because they're very technique solid. But that's a different topic, but that's what you see a lot of times in some of these players. That's why you see guys really invest in those positions and they try to, stockpile and grow. I just don't think historically it's hard to find lots of starting tackles with teams that have just a wealth of talent behind them, because they're just hard to find. They're just big guys and everybody overdrafts them. So you got to really, either expend high draft capital on them or in free agency. Again, it's where you really make a difference is when you find those mid to late round guys that you scout correctly and you develop and give them some time to grow and learn the skills of the trade.
So I want to talk about that overinvestment, because when you do have a left tackle, or in the case of Joe Ortiz and the Chargers, both tackles, both of which who were performing at a Pro Bowl level, especially when you have a quarterback who previous to that was performing at an MVP level in Justin Herbert, the urge to make a short-term fix at the cost of long-term capital is there. So when you are considering your paths and however many, picks, or what pick you would give up, as the Browns and the Vikings did in the past, or how much money you're going to outlay to one of those guys who is a older quality tackle, how do you ensure that you are not overspending, especially given you don't necessarily have the leverage in that case?
Yeah, leverage is a key term here. So in every contract negotiation, every trade negotiation, it's leverage. And you'll see people overpaying, because what happens a lot of times, you're in a situation, and different teams, truth be told, are in different position or different paths. Like some teams are in like complete rebuild mode, and they're like, okay, we're going to take our lumps this year, but our eyes to the future. So when we see a young guy come across the waiver wire, we're going to claim him because we like him, and we're going to, even though he's not going to play for us, we're going to kind of stockpile him and try to groom him. Other teams are built sometimes, and it depends on how their salary cap's set up, and in some cases their window. And they may be more inclined to, okay, let's try to keep this. Okay, we've already set this thing up. This is our season, and let's try to keep this window open. And what you'll see a lot of times, sometimes people make really good trades. Sometimes people make trades you look back on and you go, okay. And even at the time, you kind of know you're just taking on more risk. Like you never caught blindsided by it. Now that you've done the research, it's like you're making an educated guess, and sometimes you gamble a little bit more. What you want to give up and what you think in the future you'll be giving back to them in a later round draft, or a later pick in that particular round, if you finish stronger. But what I find it's interesting is that it's really a lot of discipline goes into place. And again, this goes universally. Like you can make whatever deal you want to make. You can make whatever trade you want to make for compensation. If you don't get the player right, it really doesn't matter, because in the end, you're just going to be still with a player that's a deficit. I tend to find it's hard to find, I personally believe, really quality offensive tackles that people are just willing to part ways with, unless they are in sort of a tear down, burn the ability. Hey, we don't really care. We're just stockpiling draft capital. But truth be told, even if it's a really good player, especially a player with a future, you're not going to give them away. You're going to try to keep those guys, because that's the foundation you want to build your team on. So I think you find is that you see a lot of these trades with veteran players that may have had some degree of some degree of success at some point in time in their career. They have some street value in terms of trade value. And you find, again, it's a ruthless business when it comes to trades, because it's a zero-sum game. So, you want to make sure you do everything possible to help yourself, and you have to see what the market bears for what you can get for it.
Feels like one of the toughest positions that a GM can be in here, having to wade through all of those, the fallout from those decisions. Mike Maccagnan, really appreciate you making time to join us for this conversation today. Our SumerSports colleague, you're the best.
No, anytime, guys. Appreciate it.
All right. Eager to get a different kind of perspective involved in this conversation. And so I'm very excited to welcome in Brandon Thorn, who is the preeminent O-line expert, trench expert. He works with O-line Mastermind, so he works with a lot of these guys up close and personal, knows them well, their strengths and weaknesses, also writes about them for Bleacher Report, Establish the Run, the Trench Warfare newsletter. It's Brandon Thorn. Hi, Brandon.
Hi, Lindsay. Thanks for having me.
So I wanted to pick up where Mike Maccagnan just left off, and we were talking about the inability sometimes to really pivot off of some of these losses and make a move. You are in a position where you're watching a ton of tape of offensive linemen. Where the trade deadline coming up in a few weeks, you could try to make a move to go bring in an offensive lineman. Teams are unlikely to be letting them go if they are good enough for that. Are there any ways that a general manager in this position should look to go right now, in your opinion?
It's really difficult to say, because there's just a scarcity at the position. offensive tackle in particular, offensive line as a whole, but offensive tackle specifically. It's just one of those positions similar to corner, I would say, aside from quarterback, of course. I'd say those three are probably like the most scarce positions, I think, in the NFL, especially if you're playing like a lot of man coverage, those kind of corners. So yeah, it's just tough. I mean, at any given time, I think coming into the year, I do an annual like top 75 overall offensive line ranking for the last 5 years for my newsletter. And so top 15 at each position. Dig through the film again throughout the summer to put that together. And I mean, any given year, I roughly see, like this year at left tackle, I saw maybe 15 to 17 like good left tackles in the league, and then right tackle more like 10 to 12. And then after that, I mean, there's a little bit of a cliff, maybe a gradual decline initially, and then it kind of, drops off pretty significantly. So, with that said, there's not a lot of these guys out there. And I mean, that bleeds into a lot of other things. I mean, I think that's a big reason why it's so tough for there to be a developmental football league as well, because the offensive line is just such an issue. So yeah, it's tough to find a lot of, the guys 300 plus pounds who can move that way, who are also that technically refined to do it. It's just a very difficult position to find talent.
Is that really the biggest issue, is, like, humans that are not built at that size? Or is there more to it than that?
I think that's where you have to start. There is more to it than that, but I think there's a lot of truth just in that statement alone. I don't think that's oversimplifying it. It's just, I think it goes back to, I may be getting this analogy wrong, but I think it was like the planet theory. And I think Bill Parcells subscribed to this back in the day, where he essentially just believes that, big people are harder to find. Big people beat up small people. Big people over the course of a season last longer. It really kind of fortifies you against attrition, that kind of thing. But like that's kind of what it is. Like, finding guys that are, the requisite size, which is typically 300 plus pounds, 6'3", 6'4" plus, who have, at least solid level athletic ability, play strength, power. They're tough, they're smart, they're reliable, all those sorts of things. But then I think the thing that separates offensive line, similar to corner, there's a lot of parallels actually, but it's such an unnatural position because of, specifically in pass protection, moving backwards in space against a guy who's a much better athlete than you, and becoming comfortable doing that it just takes time. And as, kind of the off season has morphed over the last decade or so, where there's less time where you're practicing football, in full pads and all that kind of stuff, you have less opportunity to get better. So, yeah, I mean, it's just it's an uphill battle to develop the position. That's why things like offensive line masterminds have become, I think, increasingly popular, to kind of fill in that gap. But yeah, like a lack of development, on top of it just being hard to find that kind of that essential ingredient of size and movement skills and power and stuff like that. It's tough.
So there's two things that I want to dig deeper into that have continued to come up in me and Lindsay's investigation of this that you just mentioned. The first one I want to ask about is the relationship between the offensive tackle position and the corner position. This is something that our scouts have said. They said they have to address it very similarly in the offseason amongst our more general manager types. What are the similarities between those two that, in this case, make offensive tackles so hard to find?
Yeah, well, I think it's man coverage corners and one-on-one pass protection. That's the main similarity. There's a couple others, but and specifically with corner in the first 5 yards. And so, like, just think of it in like the first 5 yards of man coverage corner and an offensive lineman in his first couple kicks out of his stance. And the similarities are, you want to stay square to the line of scrimmage to not give your opponent a two-way go, because if you kind of overset as a tackle, you set up an inside move. As a corner, if you bite on a fake to one side, you're going to get turned and you're going to set up kind of a soft shoulder to the other side. So staying square while moving backwards for as long as you can before declaring against a guy who's a really good athlete. The difference is corners obviously are great athletes, whereas offensive linemen are at a significant disadvantage. But then, after the first 5 yards, things obviously change from there. But I think within that first 5 yard window, staying square for as long as you can requires a lot of discipline, confidence, of course, technique, leverage, understanding like kind of who's around you and what's expected of you based on what other guys are doing and knowing your opponent and his tendencies, all that sort of stuff. I think those are some similarities. And then also, if you look at zone coverage, the secondary as a whole, in terms of like passing routes off and offensive linemen passing games off to the other four guys next to you, or as a corner to the other three or four guys next to you, but obviously more spread out across the field. There's some similarities there in terms of, spatial awareness and understanding where the guy next to you is going to be and functioning as one, as opposed to, disparate parts. So I think there's some similarities there as well. It's really interesting. I wrote an article on this like 3, 4 years ago. I talked to Darius Butler and Willie Anderson and Tony Dungy and all these guys about it. And Willie Anderson said his favorite, so Bengals right tackle, one of the greatest right tackles of all time. He said his favorite player growing up was Deion Sanders. And I thought that was so interesting because Willie Anderson's a 6'6", 340, 350-pound guy who's just, a mauling offensive lineman. And I asked him why. And he said because of his ability to stay square when he was in man coverage. And I was like, wow, what an answer. So I dug into that with him and I wrote an article about it. It was super interesting, but there are a lot of similarities to the two positions. That is, pretty fascinating, I think.
Yeah, I think it's really unique too, because you broke down the necessities and the athleticism and the techniques that make this position really hard. And is that what causes only 10 to 12 guys to be really the top tier of this position? That number has come up over and over and over again. When we looked at our Sumer Scouts, so the more traditional way to evaluate players for a team, they had about 11 guys. When we looked at our Sumer Scores analytically building it out, there was about 11 guys. What is the true separator between that top tier and everyone else?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it is how you handle yourself one-on-one in pass protection. And I think a goal of offensive coordinators and play callers, this is me just kind of guessing in a sense because I don't talk to a lot of these guys directly. I talk to some offensive line coaches, but I think based on the way that offenses look on film and how it's looked over the last 10 years, a major goal for offenses is to limit those situations for offensive linemen. So play action, RPOs, providing help, moving the pocket, sprint outs, all the sorts of things that are not true drop back passing. The more ways you can incorporate that into your offense, the more creatively you can do that, the better. And I think that's great for offensive line because it makes the job a little bit easier. It takes the most difficult thing out of the equation or at least limits it. And I think that's a huge goal. And when players can go in those sorts of situations, they usually flourish as an offensive line, individually and collectively. So I think that's a huge goal. But yeah, I mean, that's the differentiating factor. So when you have a guy like that who can survive more than others one-on-one on an island against, a pass rusher in the NFL, it opens up the menu for you in terms of a play caller and what's on the table and what's not on the table. And it just gives you more flexibility into what you could do, what you could present, how you could present it on the field, what you could call, all those sorts of things. And I think that's what tackles who could, handle themselves one-on-one, give you. And it's a rare commodity, but it's extremely valuable and it makes a huge difference.
I wonder if there are any examples that you've noticed watching film this year of, I mean, pick a team. There, it feels like there are a bunch of tackles that have left with injuries at various points of the season, and the ways that that person being lifted out has impacted what we're seeing on the field. Do you have any examples that you can think of?
Oh man, I mean the Chargers, is an obvious one with Rashawn Slater going down. One of the 5 or 6 best left tackles in the league, in my opinion. I had him as one of the 3 or 4 best, and specifically for this reason, his ability one-on-one and pass protection is outstanding. So him going out and then forcing Joe Alt to move to the left side, which is fine, that being his natural side from college, but then downgrading the right side. And then now that Joe Alt's out, we see it here more than anywhere else where you're losing two of the best tackles in the league. So that's the obvious one, I think. And, just it limits the amount of time that the quarterback can hold the ball. How route concepts play out. There's limited time for that, so you have to throw it shorter. It restricts and condenses the field, makes things feel much tighter, shrinks the margin for error, and for the quarterback and the receivers, and it just restricts everything, and it just makes it feel like there's like a lethargic kind of feeling when you watch these offenses when they have a tackle that goes down, and defenses are really, really good at creating pressure and doing all these things now to kind of capitalize on that and find that and exploit it. So, but yeah, that's the obvious one. I mean, there's so many tackles that have been hurt this year that it's a long list, but that's the first one I would start with.
I'm glad you brought up the Chargers because, truth be told, that's part of the reason that I even wanted to do this show, because it feels so obvious to me that, first of all, you're lifting Rashawn Slater out, and then you're making do, and you look good, and everyone's excited, and then Joe Alt goes out, and then they lose that game to the Giants, and it might not have just been because Joe Alt went down, but certainly that's part of what happened in the game, and I start to think about the way that the narratives are gonna go for the rest of the season, and now they're chargering, and they're not, like, and you just know that broadly, people are gonna talk about them in a certain way, and people are free to talk about any of this however they want, but that's one of the reasons I wanted to talk about the way that this trickles down into everything, because you're gonna start seeing Justin Herbert under pressure and he forces a throw and, oh, there's an interception. Now all of a sudden we're going to start having conversations about him not being good under pressure situations, right? And so that's kind of why I wanted to tackle this. And I bet you feel quite often like you're screaming into voids where this subject is concerned as well.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the with the Chargers, they're running play action extensively. So they're at least doing that. With the Greg Roman sort of offense, Jim Harbaugh, like they know how to operate when they're, I think, not even limited with an offensive line, but just kind of a conservative style offense, which they certainly need to be right now, and then let Justin Herbert do, crazy stuff to put the team on his back, which he's apt to do, he's capable of doing, and I think that's why it probably doesn't even look worse right now. So they have one of those guys at quarterback, one of the few guys who can, do these superhuman sort of plays, to make it not look as bad as it should probably, but and I feel like schematically wise, like they're doing a lot of what they should. It's just how do you overcome the point that they're at right now? And I mean, it's very difficult.
That's the honest question, I guess, that, like, if we're just going to cut to it, can you? Is
Not
there a way?
really.
Because
No,
we've
I
we've
don't think
touched
so.
on, like, there aren't any other guys that you can go get. They don't grow on trees. You can't just turn to your backup and expect the same thing. Like, I'm literally wondering if there is, and I'm not trying to put them in a, like, "You're done. It's week 6 and bye." But, like, can you overcome that?
Mm, I mean, I guess it depends on to what degree do you mean? Like, I mean, they're certainly not going to compete for like a Super Bowl or anything like that with this. Can they sneak into the playoffs or something? Maybe. I mean, Joel's coming back, so they're going to get Joel back, and then that's at least going to lift things. I think pretty significantly from there. But still, without Slater, it hurts because the right side, with Trey Pipkins, is below average. Becton missed, I mean, almost all the training camp, and then, he's missed a couple games already, and hopefully he'll stay on the field, at some point. But even that's up and down, and not getting very good center play. I mean, just they have a lot of issues, not just at tackle, that I think are going to be difficult to overcome. So yeah, I think it ultimately just shrinks your margin for error so much, and you're just trying to thread a needle almost every game, and that's just tough to do for, a whole season. So yeah, I think it just dramatically lowers the ceiling and the floor really, and it's just there's a ton of pressure on Justin Herbert now. So yeah, it's just a difficult thing. Well, I will say I would watch the Vikings Browns game to see a pretty good example of how you can scheme around a limited offensive line against a great defensive line, which they did. A lot of play action, a lot of creative help in pass protection, leaving extra guys in. I mean, I think Kevin O'Connell's one of the better guys in the league at designing offense, as a whole in general. But that was a very impressive game plan and win that they were able to get out because I mean they had a lot of guys on the offensive line out, and they were facing Myles Garrett and the Browns defensive line. So like there's the best of the best in the league, Sean McVay, Kyle Shanahan, Ben Johnson, these sort of guys who have a track record of years of putting offensive line in good positions. That's where you start. You study those films, you study those tapes, you see how those guys are their protection plans and all the different ways they can provide help to the offensive line. That's where you have to go to try to do it. But to do it for the whole season when you have multiple guys out, it's that's very tough.
I want to go deeper into the Vikings because as you were discussing how the Chargers may overcome, I immediately thought about the Vikings because they basically had to do this over the past 2 seasons, missing both their left and right tackle at times. Darisaw and O'Neal, both of who were borderline Pro Bowl performers, and over the course of having 3, for lack of a better term, at least bringing them in replacement or rookie level quarterbacks. Darnold obviously was able to perform really well. JJ being a rookie or a second year player that's never played before, and Carson Wentz. And so I want to go even deeper into exactly what they're doing to manage that. Exactly what are those protection plans that other teams around the league might be able to pick up?
Yeah, another one last year is Denver and Sean Payton and what he did with Bo Nix and that offensive line and Zach Strief, the offensive line. Of course, that's another one I would throw in. But when I think of like the Vikings and there's some parallels with a lot of these names that I mentioned. Um, I think the first thing is the easy stuff. Working in RPOs and play action just to make life a little easier on the offensive line, which the Vikings typically are one of the higher, play action percentage teams in the league. And, that's essentially offensive linemen are, selling run, but they're pass blocking, but they're selling run. It makes it takes some of the guesswork out for the offensive line, and it puts more of the onus on the quarterback to get rid of the ball, buys him a little bit of extra time. Typically with play action, there's also a tight end or a back getting involved in the protection as well. So it's a 6 or 7 man protection. So you have, help. Um, and the way teams do it is one thing that I often see when a team is facing a high end edge rusher, TJ Watt, Aiden Hutchinson, some of these guys, um, they'll run play action away from that player, Aiden Hutchinson, but they'll have a tight end on his side, and they'll either use 2 tight ends on his side and put 2 tight ends on him in pass protection, so the offensive line doesn't even have to worry about him, and they'll just full slide the opposite direction and they'll boot away. That's one way. Or having a tight end or a receiver work across the line of scrimmage, in a jet motion with the tight end already on the line on that side, and just give him something to process in route to the quarterback. Having a back chip release to help the tackle, and just the presence of a running back in the backfield coming up is going to kind of restrict the lane that the pass rusher has to work with. So that's another way. Um, I mean, there's a lot of different ways that teams do it, and there's a lot of different formations to get to it at. And I think that's the key is just having a variety of ways to get to these different ways of providing help, whether it's back, tight end, receivers, even. We see a lot of condensed formations. I think that's another way. Squeeze formations is what Kansas City calls it, I believe, under Andy Reid. I remember Mitchell Schwartz told me that years ago. He liked having squeeze formations, which is a condensed formation where the pass rusher feels just the body presence of a receiver and just that threat of getting, knocked, ear hold that could create just a half second of hesitation as he gets out of his stance. And pass rushers win with their get off. So if you could slow down their get off even just for a split second, that could be the difference in a win and a loss. So yeah, there's a lot of ways that these offensive coordinators do it, I think those are the ones that I see week in, week out from those names over the years, and it's awesome to see as somebody who's watching offensive line. It kinda stinks because I don't get to see the one-on-one reps, so it's like not very helpful from an evaluation perspective on that offensive lineman. But putting myself in an offensive lineman's shoes, it's awesome to see because it's like, man, you're in a situation here, a system that they're making life easier on you consistently, and those are some of the ways they do it.
You brought up something there that made me think, for people who are coming at this with different purposes, sometimes people looking through a fantasy lens, mentioning the tight ends and the ways that they are impacted by this, sometimes having to stay in to block a little bit more frequently in some of these situations. Could this maybe be something to look for people who are looking for whether or not this is going to be a big week or year or whatever for that fantasy, for the tight end in fantasy, where if maybe an offensive tackle goes down, maybe kind of stop looking for them in the passing game quite as much, that tight end?
Yeah, I mean, I think so, especially if they don't have a good blocking tight end at the tight end 2 spot. I would also add that factor in there because then maybe more of the onus will be on them. Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, for establish the run, I try to predict pressure every week or lack thereof. So I'm looking at a lot of these things, and I've been doing that for 6, 7 years now for them, from a fantasy perspective, trying to do that. But what you just said for tight ends, I think is there's definitely something there. I think 12 personnel, 2 tight ends on the field, weaponizing that, knowing how to utilize that, having a good number 2 tight end, in terms of a blocker, I think, we've seen talked about more, and I think that could be a real helpful element, for teams. And, it's not necessarily that you need that. It also helps in the run game, of course, but that definitely, I think, is one of those factors that a lot of teams or some teams at least are leaning into with some success, and I think it could be a real differentiating factor and for your protection plan having that.
All right, we're talking about this position in kind of a negative way in the sense that we're like, oh no, it sucks when you lose the good guys. Let's end on a positive note. Yeah, I know you're watching tape of all of these guys. Give me a name of somebody who is playing well this year at the offensive tackle position, because we're focused on that people are not talking about as much as they should, in your opinion.
I mean, I don't really hear his name very often right now, and he's just a big name. Laramie Tunsil with the Commanders, I think, is kind of back to, last year he was still really good. He just got penalized a lot. So that, kind of hurt his perception of him. But when you're watching him one on one in pass protection, that's what made Laramie Tunsil, what has made him one of the highest paid offensive tackles over the last, 7, 8 years is because of his ability one on one in pass protection to be really good. I think that is largely back this year. He's faced really good competition over the first few weeks. The Giants, Brian Burns, Abdul Carter, Kayvon Thibodeau, and then the Packers game. I think the best tape that I've watched one-on-one pass protection so far this year in terms of the most entertaining was the fourth quarter of the Commanders-Packers game between Larry Tunsil and Micah Parsons. It was just a heavyweight fight. Each of them just throwing haymakers at each other, proverbial haymakers at each other, decisive one-on-one wins. Parsons had one on him, but Tunsil had like 3 or 4 on him. That to me is just like, get your popcorn out. If you want to see pass protection at the very highest level, watch Tunsil versus Parsons. Fourth quarter was that week 1 or 2, whatever that was. So I think Tunsil's made a real difference. When Sam Cosmi comes back to Washington, I think that offensive line could be one of the best in the league. So I'm really excited about that. I'd also throw out, I think Garrett Bowles is playing really good football right now for the Broncos as well. He was good last year. I had him as like we do a 3-team all pro offensive line show. He was my 3rd team left tackle last year. So I thought he was really good last year. And I think he kind of picked up where he left off last year and then some. So I would throw out Bowles as well as kind of maybe a lesser name than Tunsil.
I saw Sam, a big smile break over his face, and I know exactly why. I was looking at the SumerScore data earlier today, and Bowles is consistently every single week one of our highest rated tackles. So I'm not surprised that you
Nice.
mentioned him. And then Laramie Tunsil was his guy after week 4. He was our first team offensive tackle on
Oh,
this
nice.
SumerScore team. One last thing that I want to get to, and I don't know if Sam has any other questions, but I know I said let's end on, and then I got to go backwards because you mentioned Laramie Tunsil's penalties, and it made me think of another question that I actually wanted to ask you about, and it is related to the Chargers, not to go back to them too frequently, but Trey Pipkins with the back-to-back penalties on would have been first downs in the passing game. made me think that that was maybe kind of not just him messing up, but a sign of an overmatched offensive lineman. Like, do you think that that is something that we tend to see when offensive linemen find themselves in a situation where they're up against someone who's just beating them? Like, is that maybe a tell sometimes that that situation is existing?
Yeah, I mean, holding specifically, yeah. I mean, I think a lot of Tunsil's stuff was false starts last year. Just to go back, like he was just trying to get out of his stance too quickly. He had a ton of false starts, some holdings, but I think a lot of it was that. But yeah, like specifically, I would say holding. It's funny that we brought up Bulls because he's a fascinating case study in development and offensive line because his first few years were rough, and he came into the league as an older prospect out of Utah. He was like 25-year-old rookie. He got penalized so much, and they were bad penalties, holdings. And then Mike Munchak got there, saved his career, revamped him from the ground up in terms of his technique. And now Garrett Bowles is Garrett Bowles. But there was first 3-4 years as an older prospect, people thought, man, Bowles is just kind of a wasted first round pick because he was like late first round. Anyway, I don't want to, sorry, I went kind of down a rabbit hole there. That was interesting because Bowles was super penalized. But with Pipkins, especially in that game, Commanders Chargers, that's the thing. Like if you're down, in a game and you're in obvious passing situations, the offensive coordinator can only kind of bail you out so much because, everybody kind of knows what you have to do here. You have to gain yards in chunks, and you have to do that typically by throwing the ball down the field. So you're in obvious passing situations, so you can't really dress it up so much from a scheme perspective. It's, we're going to drop back and try to pass the ball. And when you're in that sort of scenario as a backup offensive lineman or a well below average offensive lineman, that's just when, you want to try to avoid those obviously at all costs. So he was in bad situation, obvious dropback situations, down big. And yeah, that was kind of a given, I think.
Brandon Thorn, great as always. Thank you so much for your time and expertise. This has been really enlightening for both of us, I think. Brandon Thorn NFL is where you can find him on social media with links to all of his work in all of the many, many places that you put your work. You're a busy dude.
Yeah. Yeah. Thankfully I am.
Lots of employers. Thank you so much for your time.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, Sam, that was interesting. Like, I love our nerdy deep dives into very specific issues in play. But I think that this one's very, very relevant. And my pet peeve is when people talk about things too broadly from a football standpoint without really diving into the why behind it. And so my hope, I guess, in some ways is that this sort of exposes some of the why behind what's happening with various teams around the league.
Yeah, I think there's 3 facts that appear to be consensus AI scheme media that I didn't really know prior to, that we kind of came to the idea of. Number 1, that the reason why offensive tackles are so valuable is because it's one of maybe 2 one-on-one matchups, and unlike corners, it's a one-on-one matchup pretty much every single pass. And I think that was a really key insight that both Brandon and Mike and the data gave us. The second result of that is that there's really only 10 or 11 tackles, excellent quality tackles in this league, and you got to try to identify that. And the funniest part is, like, the Chargers did that twice, and now they're sitting here due to the way that football works, due to the variance of football.
They did it right.
Right,
They got
exactly.
it right.
Exactly.
And they're still here.
They got it right. And so the question is, can you replace that from the personnel perspective? No. Like, that seems to be the consensus. No. So it's going to come down on Greg Roman and Jim Harbaugh and the rest of that offense to utilize some of those key pieces, more people blocking, condensed sets, more play action, more under center. It's going to be up to them to make those changes in the next week, which really sucks because they had an offense that had, at this point, maybe 3 wide receivers on the outside who could win, 2 tackles that could win one-on-one, and a quarterback that we really trusted, not to mention a running back who is now also out that seemed to be building into a running back that was also very good. So I am bemoaning the loss of good football, but I'm glad we came to these insights as a result of it.
Yeah, I also think that this is gonna be a podcast that's worth going back and listening to come draft time,
Oh,
or at
100%.
least lifting some of the high level thoughts there, because we already knew that if a good offensive tackle comes around, you move him up the draft board. We knew that broadly, but, like, I think we have some really extreme examples this year about just how important that is, and maybe it's kind of the same sort of conversation that we talk about in terms of just like darts at a dartboard, like just keep taking them, just keep taking your shots, like we talk about quarterbacks in that manner. Maybe the same is true for offensive tackles. Like just go ahead and take that shot if the body type is there, and maybe like cross your fingers that it all kind of works out. Like, because there are question marks attached to a lot of different people. Not everybody comes out and is like a fully packaged, like, yes, go grab them high. But might be worth moving somebody up the board when we're talking about like our mock drafts and stuff like that for that reason.
Yeah, there was all kinds of little tiny analytical tidbits that as the real season moves on, I want to track. And as the draft season comes around, I want to track with the college players, such as edge rushers win fast. And so you want to understand who's eliminating that quickly in the draft. That's definitely going to be something that I'm going to refer back to over and over again. And the way that Mike said you prepare to draft an offensive tackle, I'm definitely going to refer back to that again. So lots of cool little tidbits to come back to.
Um, I just want to point out real quick before we go again, go try out Sumer Brain, SumerSports.com/SumerBrain. It's free for you to join this beta period where our goal is for you to break the brain. There have been some people who have already done that, who have come up with prompts that the brain did not answer correctly. And that's honestly, in a lot of ways, our goal at this stage of the game. We want to figure out where those weaknesses are so we can kind of fix them up, and then be cooking with gas. But I do want to say there were tons of examples in my research that I pulled from Sumer Brain. This was a very interesting show for that reason, because it gave me an opportunity to kind of layer some stats on top of one another, because we wanted to see these with, without, and multi stats. So the prompt that I used here for this, just as an example, for like a prompt that will get you good information if you want to pull out some of these things. Using the play-by-play data you have, please divide the season into two parts: before Joe Alt got hurt and after Joe Alt got hurt. After the first 11 plays of week 4 and all of week 5, he was out. In a table, please show me the following for each: EPA per play, time to throw, time to pressure, pressure rate, sack rate, average depth of target. And then up pops a table with all of that information. What do you say, like 30 to 45 seconds later? I mean, the amount of time that takes you, like, can you even imagine trying to go find that information without a machine like this?
No, exactly. I'm about to log off of this and then immediately start asking about correlations between time to pressure over the course of a season
Oh, I love it.
and defensive EPA, because that's another major takeaway I've gotten from this podcast. And so, like, I'm literally about to go do what you just said, Lindsay, as a result of what I listened to here.
Quick note: as much as you can be detailed and ask for specific data points, that's how it is going to return the best information. Obviously, we're working towards a direction where you can ask a super broad question and it will give you all of the detailed answers that you're actually looking for. But I would be remiss if I suggested that it was absolutely there yet. Again, that's part of the break the brain process. So as specifically as you can ask, or if you, rather than saying like, how are the Dolphins doing this year? Ask for the specific data points that would prove to you that they were doing well or not doing well. That's when it's going to be at its best. So go have fun with that. And we'll see you again next week, post week 6, when we're talking about quarterbacks. We've got some fun conversations on the back burner for that one.